Hello, welcome to Lab 3. In this lab, we will finish going through all of our different tissues. We're going to go through the skin, the different layers of the skin, all the different parts to the skin in this lab as well. So let's start with the different types of connective tissue. Connective tissue is usually found underneath epithelial tissue. So here we have areolar connective tissue. Areolar connective tissue, it's considered a loose connective tissue because it has a lot of what is called ground substance, like liquid kind of found throughout between all the different types of tissues that are found within here. Areolar tissue has collagen fibers, which are these thicker pink kind of fibers here that are found throughout. They have elastic fibers. That's these kind of dark purple. I'm drawing over them in black. Fibers, those are elastic fibers. They have these cells that are called fibroblasts. Anytime we see blast in a word, blast means they build something. So a fibroblast is building this connective tissue, this areolar connective tissue. There's usually some sort of immune cells in areolar connective tissue. That's these mast cells. There may be some reticular fibers found throughout here. But it's just a collection of a lot of different types of cells, proteins like that collagen, those elastin fibers or elastic fibers. But there's a lot of ground substance, just a lot of empty space is another way to kind of describe it. This is found in your skin underneath. This says your subcutaneous tissue, but it's also found within this middle layer here. The next type of tissue is called adipose tissue. Is your paper on your sheet adipose? Adipose is fat. These are fat cells. We need a certain amount of fat cells for protection. Think around your eyeball. There's a lot of this adipose tissue that is protecting your eyeball from the bone that makes up your skull. There's a lot of adipose. There's adipose tissue that's even used kind of as packing material, just like this areolar connective tissue. Areolar connective tissue is known as the universal packing material. Test question on the written test. Adipose tissue kind of does some of that packing material as well. When we're looking at adipocytes, site means cell. So we're looking at fat cells. What makes a fat cell different? They look like big white bubbles. Their nucleus is towards the outside. It gets pushed all the way to the outer edge of that specific cell. So adipose tissue is going to be this fat that has big white soap bubbles, big white bubbles with the nucleus just pushed to the outside. And then it's just a large area of fat storage. We're storing fat soluble vitamins, proteins, carbohydrates that we don't use, get converted to fat and stored in our adipose cells. The next type of tissue is reticular connective tissue. In this specific picture, this picture to me almost looks like a cherry blossom tree. I don't know why. That's just the first thing I think of. These are found in your lymphatic tissue. So this is where your immune tissue is made up of this reticular connective tissue. It looks like a tree, at least. I can get that part out. The tree, and then all the little red areas would be like the flowers or the leaves, but these are those reticular cells. In this picture, I have some other ones later on that we'll go through as well that look a little bit different than this one, but that's where this, to me, looks like. I try to differentiate as much as I can for these to help you guys figure out what is what. Okay, this one's got a long name to it. Dense regular connective tissue. Your tendons that attach your muscle to bones are made of dense regular connective tissue. What this is made up of is a lot of collagen fibers. So these are going to be long pink cells that travel pretty much the entire length of the slide that you're going to picture that you're going to look at when you determine what this is. But it's just long pieces. They may have these really small nuclei for those fibroblasts, but they're very far and few between. You don't see a lot of nuclei in there. It's mostly just pink fibers, those collagen fibers specifically. I'm pointing out the nuclei because this gets confused with smooth muscle, something we'll look at in a little bit, and you'll kind of see why when you get there. So I'm trying to give you little points to differentiate. Okay, now we have dense, irregular connective tissue. Remember, dense regular? Our collagen fibers are in nice, neat rows. Dense, irregular. Okay, now my collagen fibers are going in many different directions. Some are long. You may see some long fibers coming. You may see some other ones that are kind of pointing straight out at you. So this fibers just travel in a lot of different directions. This is found, as this picture shows here, just below that epithelial tissue in your skin. Well, most of this area is that dense irregular connective tissue because it helps your skin have this nice tensile force. So it can be pulled in multiple directions without being pulled. That is what makes this dense irregular connective tissue so different than, say, this dense regular. We can only really pull our tissue in one direction before things are starting to tear. Here we can go in multiple directions because these collagen fibers are going many different directions throughout. Elastic connective tissue. Elastic connective tissue, it does show all of these little black squiggly lines throughout here. That's all elastic tissue. So it's just hundreds to thousands of elastic fibers that make up this elastic connective tissue. This is your heart, of course, the aorta. This is the main artery that comes off of your heart that helps take blood and distribute it around your body. This is made of elastic connective tissue because that artery has to be able to stretch every time blood gets pushed into that aorta from the heart. So that's why we have that elastic tissue, is to allow that stretch of that blood vessel whenever blood gets pumped in. Okay, now we're looking at cartilage. This is hyaline cartilage. We'll look at the differences between the different types of cartilage here. Hyaline cartilage is the most abundant cartilage in the body. It's one we have the most of in a fetus. a developing fetus, the skeleton starts as hyaline cartilage before it calcifies over. So, chondro means cartilage. I like to teach medical terminology as I go because it helps you to understand where these terms are coming from. And again, cyte means cell or cells. The specific type of cell that is found in hyaline or in any kind of cartilage is known as a chondrocyte. These chondrocytes are going to sit in this little area that is known as a lacuna. When a chondrocyte builds cartilage, they build cartilage 360 degrees all around them, up, above, below, around, all over. They seclude themselves and maybe another chondrocyte, maybe a few in that same area. That area where they seclude themselves into is that lacuna. In hyaline cartilage specifically, these chondrocytes usually do not, like the most superficial ones, do not pick up color. So these chondrocytes, these cells are going to remain white on the most superficial layers. Some of the darker ones, you see some darker ones back here, those ones are deeper in from that layer of cartilage that was taken. So the ones that are most superficial on hyaline cartilage specifically. I say that because we have fibrous cartilage or fibrocartilage, as it's also called. If I can spell, that would be even better. That should be an R there. Fibrous cartilage or fibrocartilage. This is cartilage that has a lot of collagen in it. Why do we need a lot of collagen? Because it needs to be tough. So in your back, these are those vertebrae that I had mentioned before that make up your back. Between the two vertebrae, we have this which means between, vertebral, so between the vertebrae, a disc that is made of this fibrocartilage. It needs to be very tough because it needs to withstand all the different movements you do throughout the day. This intervertebral disc does. Your pubic symphysis. So in the front of your pelvis, there is a fibrocartilage disc that's made of this same type of tissue here. You can still see the chondrocytes. You can see the dark nucleus of them. You can see them better when they zoom in really close. I've got some better pictures of the fibrocartilage we'll go through here shortly, but these are the ones direct from your textbook. The other type of cartilage we have is elastic cartilage. All of these black fibers is elastic fibers. All those little black pieces, strings, they kind of look like little spider webs almost, but that's all elastic fibers. All of these elastic fibers allow this tissue to stretch. So your ear is made of this elastic cartilage. We still have these chondrocytes, something bright, these chondrocytes through here. So you can see these cells, this large group of cells, they're sitting in that lacunae. These large groups of cells found through here, they're still here, but the ground substance around them is just all these elastic fibers. That's where we get that elastic cartilage from. Bone. This is compact bone. Bone looks like, this is probably a really good example right through here. It looks like a bunch of tree rings to me. If you've ever cut a tree and see all the rings That's what bone looks like. And they're just several tree rings together. Since we only need to know compact bone, this is all you'd need to know if you saw this was bone. It looks like a bunch of tree rings. The next one, the other one that's pretty easy to see, blood. For this specific class, all you need to be able to know is that this is blood. You do not need to be able to identify the different types of blood cells. You will do that in anatomy too when you have an entire chapter on blood. So here, this is just blood. You don't need to identify the red blood cells, the white blood cells. Just know that this is blood. Plain and simple. This one and bone are probably the two easiest. Now we have skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle are made up of fibers that are very long. Skeletal muscle has these striations, as they're called, these stripes that travels most of the length. Skeletal muscle, usually one cell, this really long cell here, will usually have several nuclei to that one cell. Because when a skeletal muscle forms, it's several cells that come together to form that one long cell. So that's where those several nuclei are going to come into play. I'm trying to point this out because cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle still has some of those striations in there. Cardiac muscle, blue. We have these dark red lines here. Those dark red lines are known as intercalated discs. You don't necessarily need to know the name of this now. That'll come back in this muscle chapter, but just to kind of help to differentiate. These intercalated discs will separate one cell, one muscle, cardiac muscle fiber cell from the next. The other thing we will see, this isn't the best example, but cardiac muscle will branch sometimes. Sometimes we'll see lots of little branches going out. So this one doesn't show like the best example. I've got some better ones that actually shows the branching in there. So I'll point it out in those pictures. Then the one that people like to confuse with dense regular connective tissue. This is actually smooth muscle. What makes smooth muscle different? Remember those dense regular connective tissue with lots of long fibers that travel like the entire length? Smooth muscle cells are kind of this really badly drawn fusiform shape. They'll have a nucleus in the middle. So we're going to have a lot of nuclei. So we see lots of nuclei kind of found throughout. A lot of them, and they're large nuclei. You see lots of cells. Some start there, another one starts in the middle there, another one here. So you can kind of see the difference. There are going to be more nuclei in smooth muscle. And you can usually somewhat see outline shaped of cells here. Then we have nervous tissue. As far as you need to know, you just need to know that this is nervous tissue. You don't need to know any further than that right now. We'll go into it when we get to the nervous system at the end of this semester or this semester. Let's look at skin. Your skin is split up into different sections. We have the epidermis. Epi means above. The dermis, which is that middle layer, and then that subcutaneous layer, which is also known as the hypodermis. Hypo means below the dermis. The epidermis is split up into different layers. If you're looking at your lab sheet, we'll go through those layers when we have a better picture of it. This one's not going to show them all. But let's look at some of the features of the dermis. So within the dermis, we're going to have hair follicles. This is a hair follicle. In this hair follicle, we're going to have a muscle that's attached to it. This is a smooth muscle. This muscle contracts and gives you goosebumps. It causes your hairs to stand straight up. That is known as the erector pili muscle. We are going to have Meissner's corpuscles or corpuscle of touch. On your sheet, it also is this is labeled in your PowerPoint. Your book is tactile corpuscles. Tactile means touch. We have the dermal papilla. So within this papillary dermis here, the dermal papilla is where this dermal tissue goes up into that epidermis. So it's the parts of this connective tissue, all this, everything that's happening that's going up higher into that dermis. Why? Because epithelial tissue does not have direct blood supply. There's no blood vessels in the epidermis or in those epithelial tissues at all, nothing. So these blood vessels, see these blood vessels here, kind of traveling through? These blood vessels, they come up into this papillary dermis to help nutrients diffuse up higher into that epidermis. We've got, going down the list here, the lamellar corpuscles. Those are found towards the bottom of the dermis. We have that hair follicle that I mentioned. The hair root is the inside that makes the hair. That hair follicle that kind of technically wraps around that hair root. The hair shaft is this area that starts to come up. This is that hair shaft. We have attached to our hair follicles, we have these glands here. They are called sebaceous glands. These are glands that make oil. So these oil gets secreted out of these sebaceous glands and into these hair follicles that come out to your skin. This is what helps to keep your skin soft, your hair soft, is this oil that's coming out of these sebaceous glands. So let's start looking at some of this stuff in slides, because this is how it's going to be asked for your lab practical. It's going to be slides like this, pictures. So we can see that hair root, that hair follicle that's wrapped around that hair root. You see this? No, that's not what I want. There we go. Sebaceous gland here. the oil in the cells is all white. It doesn't pick up any kind of color to them. You can you see that epidermis and then that whole dermis. I mentioned that sebaceous gland. Here is that tactile corpuscle right here that is found in that dermal papilla. Now let's look, because this one you can see the different layers of the epidermis as well. So the bottom layer of the epidermis is known as the stratum basal. Basal, bottom. Each time it's going to have the word stratum in there for the layer. The stratum basal is one single layer of cells that travels on that's the very bottom. This is the layer of cells that are constantly going through that mitosis. Excuse me, that constant cell division. Once that new cell gets made, one cell gets pushed up to the next layer. That's the stratum spinosum. It's labeled as the stratum spinosum because these cells kind of have some sorts of points to them. According to your textbook, I can see some of them throughout, but that's because these cells are attached to each other. And as these cells get pushed up, the one next to it may not be ready to be pushed up yet. And that's what starts to cause the cells that are still attached to each other to form these points. Is because one's getting pushed up while the other one kind of stays towards the bottom. The next layer up is the stratum granulosum. It's the nice thing with the stratum granulosum is you see all of these dark granules in here. Those dark granules are these kind of fat granules that get made. We make proteins at this point for our cells to help make our cells tough, and they make our cells waterproof. We don't want different substances to absorb in through our skin that shouldn't. So like when you go swimming, take a shower, take a bath, you don't want water to be absorbed into your skin. So we create this waterproof layer within our skin that prevents that from happening. The next layer is the stratum lucidum. This is only found on the palms of hands in the soles of your feet. That is where thick skin is found. So the stratum lucidum is only found in thick skin. It is a clear, translucent layer. So this red kind of layer here that has nothing to it, no nucleus, no nothing, that is that stratum lucidum. The layer of skin that we can see when you look at your hand, your arm, your legs, is the stratum corneum. This is 30 to 60 layers of cells deep, and these cells are all dead. The cells die at the stratum granulosum just because they're getting too far away from nutrients. At this point, these cells are just working their way up till that top layer gets sloughed off. Here we can see that dermal papilla, which is where that tissue goes up. That dermis goes up into that epidermis. So here's some other pictures. They're labeled up at the top, that areolar connective tissue. You can see all the white in there. That is that ground substance. There is nothing there besides liquid kind of type of substance that is keeping this collagen these elastic fibers, those fibroblasts, doing what they need to do. Again, this is kind of that universal packing material. Here's a bunch of fat cells. So here's that adipose tissue. You can see the little tiny nuclei that is pushed off to the side of the cell that may even look like it's outside of the cell. And they're just a bunch of white, bubbles. Here's another example of that adipose cells, just lots of white, kind of soap bubbly kind of appearance. Here is reticular. My other example of that reticular connective tissue. Again, you can kind of see branches of trees and then little black dots, because this is a different stain that was used, are all the different leaves that are found throughout. Here we have dense, regular connective tissue. This is that collagen fibers, lots of long collagen fibers that travel throughout. You see a lot of nuclei in this picture, but it's just that dense, regular connective tissue. Here's a better example. You see those long collagen fibers kind of found throughout here. Then you see nuclei of these fibroblasts here, but they're kind of more spread out. They're far and few between. That's that dense, regular connective tissue. Here is that dense, irregular connective tissue. Again, we have those collagen fibers, but this time these collagen fibers are going in lots of different directions. Here's another example of elastic connective tissue. Here you just see lots of black elastic fibers, the little zigzags, all these little ziggy zags that are going across here. Those are just elastic fibers that are in a relaxed position. Here's another example of that elastic connective tissue. Just a different stain. But you see lots of those black zigzaggy fibers, making it that elastic connective tissue. Here's that hyaline cartilage. Down here, it's labeled off to the side. You see those kind of white cells. The difference between this and fat cells is these cells are further apart. And here, the nucleus is in the middle of the cell. They're not off somewhere else. Here we get zoomed up closer. You can see those specific chondrocytes, those specific cells. The nucleus is in the middle. And then you kind of have that pink kind of ground substance, that cartilage found around it. This isn't the best example of hyaline cartilage, but I wanted you to kind of see it. I'm not going to give you, I'm not going to test you off of this picture specifically. Maybe this one, maybe that one, maybe this one. This is another hyaline cartilage, just even closer up. Just going through the different zooms so you can see it at different magnifications. Here at that fibrocartilage again, this is at your pubic symphysis in the front of your pelvis. Here, these chondrocytes pick up dye. So they're picking up that dark stain. That's another thing that makes fibroblasts different. They also have all that collagen fibers, that dark pink collagen fibers kind of spread throughout. Now we have that elastic cartilage. This one's not the best picture. You can see some of those chondrocytes with the elastic fibers in there. Here's a better picture of that elastic cartilage. It's just zoomed in even further. So you can see all that black elastic fibers with those specific chondrocytes, those specific cells found spread throughout. Here's another example of elastic cartilage. Bone. You can see lots of circular types of areas that looks like tree rings. Here's a better example of bone, circular types of areas that just look like a lot of tree rings. Even closer up. Here's skeletal muscle. This is a pretty far away, so I wouldn't necessarily give you something like this. Even that's far away. This is a much better picture of skeletal muscle because you see all of these striations that are found within this one long cell. You see all of these nuclei. Here, that's a blood vessel. Blood vessel. We have our blood vessels that go through our muscles because we need nutrients from our blood. So here it is. Here's just another example of skeletal muscle, just to kind of so you can see what different skeletal muscle looks like. Again, you can see these long cells with all of those striations, so all of those lines traveling throughout the entire tissue. Here we get to cardiac muscle. I don't like that picture. I like this one. This picture, you can see these darker lines, those intercalated discs. You can kind of see where these cells may branch in these different directions. You can tell me if you think I'm hallucinating or not, but they kind of do. So we get these cells that kind of go here, one that'll go that direction, this way. They may come together to that one cell. Cardiac muscle will branch. They have these intercalated discs, these darker areas, because they will still have those striations. You can see these lines, those striations still, but they have this darkened area, those intercalated discs as they're called, between cells, and those cells are not as long as they are with skeletal muscle. Smooth muscle. Remember, in smooth muscle, we have a lot of nuclei. Those nuclei are what make it different from that dense regular connective tissue. So here's another example. There's a lot of nuclei. There's lots of cells in there in that smooth muscle. Same here. We have a lot of nuclei within those cells. Then here is our nervous tissue. Just knowing that's nervous tissue. Same here. You don't need to know the specific type of neuron. And then we get to our skin. Here's some different things that I did not get to point out earlier. Here is that Pacinian corpuscle, or that lamellated corpuscle. You get that epidermis, dermis, hypodermis. You don't have eccrine, just making sure you don't have that eccrine sweat gland there. But those are different sweat glands that are found within your skin. Now, if we zoom in, we took that picture, same picture and went closer. You can see that epidermis. In that papillary layer, you can see where this tissue goes up high. So that would be that papillary, or the dermal papilla is what it's called on your sheet. I want to make sure I was saying the right name there. Now we can get in and we zoom in even closer, we can start to see the different layers of the skin. Starting here, we have that Meissner's corpuscle, or corpuscle of touch, same thing, found within one of those dermal papilla. We can see that stratum basal, that very bottom layer, the stratum spinosum, that's not going to work, middle layer. We see that stratum granulosum, That's that really dark layer. And then this is thin skin. Thin skin only has 4 layers to it, so we have that stratum corneum, whoops, which is that very top layer. All right, take that back. This is thick skin. They do technically show that stratum lucidum, which it's kind of hard to see here, but it's this little thin layer just above that stratum granulosum. My bad. So here is that Meissner's corpuscle, just a closer view of it. You can even see that stratum basale, that very bottom layer of the epidermis. Here we're getting into that dermis hypodermis. So we have that Pacinian corpuscle or lamellated corpuscle, same thing. I take both. That's why I go through and check all of these after the due date to make sure. If I put one name, it only let me put one name, but if you put Pacinian corpuscle and I had lamellated corpuscle, I'd still go in and give you the point for it. So I want to make, that's why I wait till after the due date and I go through and check answers. Because I do accept both. Now we can get into some of these hair follicles and sebaceous glands. So you can see these different hair follicles. You can even see that erector pili muscle right here. It's kind of a thin little muscle there. You can see some of the sebaceous glands. It's a little hard on this picture. Here's a better view. You can see that sebaceous gland right through here. Here's a better picture of that erector pili muscle as well. You can see this muscle right through here. Now we're getting into, you can see that follicle, that hair follicle, that's that wall. You can see that hair, you can see that papilla, which is found throughout here. You can see that hair root, and you can start to see that hair shaft coming up the top. These are all labeled on this picture. FYI, some of these may come from this picture. Here you can see that papilla. You can see that hair follicle, that wall. You can see that hair root. Here's a really good example of sebaceous glands, some really good sebaceous glands. Hint, hint. That something may come from here because they're really good examples of what we're looking for. So I will use these exact pictures. So if you learn things off of these exact pictures and you're able to recall them when you take your test, you'll do good. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you very much for listening.